Thrown out at 14, she built a hay burrow. Niels Bjornson, who had survived 9 Dakota winters, told her flatly, "A girl alone won't survive. You'll freeze in that pile of grass." She had $3, no family, and needed shelter she could not build. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 60 degrees in 7 hours. But 5 months earlier, Hanna Kjelland had never spent a single night alone on the open prairie. In August of 1887, Hanna stood beside a fresh grave on the Lindstrom Claim in Davison County, Dakota Territory. The mound of dirt was still dark with moisture. The woman beneath it, Ingrid Lindstrom, had been the closest thing to a mother Hanna had known in 2 years. Hanna was 14 years old. She had arrived on an orphan train from New York at age 12, one of the 200,000 children shipped west between 1854 and 1929 to find new families or, more often, to find work. The Lindstroms had taken her in. They had needed help on the claim. She had needed a place that wasn't the streets of the Bowery. Now Eric Lindstrom was gone, fled to the Black Hills 3 weeks earlier, chasing gold rumors and leaving behind everything that reminded him of failure. His wife had lasted 19 days without him. Consumption, the neighbors would say later. But Hanna had watched Ingrid stop eating, stop talking, stop caring whether she woke up each morning. Some sicknesses started in the lungs. This one started in the heart. Hanna patted the grave dirt flat with her palms. She had no shovel, so she had dug with a broken hoe in her bare hands. It had taken most of a day. Her fingernails were black with soil. $3.40. That was what Ingrid had pressed into her palm 2 days before the end. All the money that remained from a homestead that had once held 40 head of cattle, a working plow, and dreams of proving up the claim. The cattle had frozen the previous winter. The Great Die-Up, people called it. The winter of 1886 to 87 that killed hundreds of thousands of animals across the northern plains. The Lindstroms had lost everything, every cow, every calf, every penny of savings spent trying to feed animals that died anyway. Eric had stopped speaking in full sentences by March. Ingrid had stopped eating in April. By July, he was gone. Hanna looked around the claim. 160 acres of Dakota prairie, most of it unbroken grass. The soddy where the Lindstroms had lived for 4 years had collapsed during a thunderstorm in June. The roof timbers rotted through, the walls slumping inward like a tired man sitting down for the last time. Only the dugout root cellar remained intact, and it flooded every time it rained. She had nowhere to go. The nearest town was Mitchell, 12 miles east. She had no horse, no wagon, no way to get there except walking. And if she got there, what then? Find a family that wanted another mouth to feed? Be shipped back east on the return train, back to the orphanages, back to the streets? She had $3.40, no shelter, no food stores, no fuel for a stove she didn't have, and winter was 10 weeks away. Niels Bjornson arrived on horseback 3 days later. Hanna had seen him before, a weathered Norwegian in his late 50s, owner of the farm a mile to the northwest. He had survived 9 Dakota winters, people said, as if that were a credential. Given how many didn't survive even one, perhaps it was. Bjornson stopped his horse at the edge of the collapsed soddy and looked down at Hanna. She was sitting in the grass, trying to sharpen the rusted scythe she had found in the Lindstroms' dugout. "Lindstrom's girl," he said. It wasn't a question. "Hanna," she said, "you're still here." "I'm still here." Bjornson dismounted. He walked the perimeter of the collapsed soddy, looked into the flooded dugout, studied the empty fields where cattle had once grazed. His right hand was missing 2 fingers. The third and fourth, sheared off cleanly at the second knuckle. Frostbite, she had heard. The blizzard of 1881. "Where's your firewood?" he asked. "I don't have any." Your stores? Your preserved food? I don't have any. Your stove? Lindstrom took it when he left. Bjornson stood silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, not cruel, just stating a fact, the way someone might note that the sky was blue or water ran downhill. A girl alone can't survive a Dakota winter. You have no shelter, no fuel, no food, no family. He held up his three-fingered hand. I lost these to a blizzard that lasted 2 days. I was inside my house when it started. I had a stove burning full. I nearly died walking 30 feet to my barn. He let the hand drop. You'll freeze in that pile of grass, and nobody will find your body until spring thaw. Hannah said nothing. I can take you to Mitchell, Bjornson said. The church there, they send girls back east. Find you a family. No. Bjornson studied her. His eyes were pale blue, nearly colorless, like ice over deep water. Stubbornness killed the Lindstroms, he said. Stubbornness and bad luck in this damned prairie. Don't let it kill you, too. I'm not leaving. He mounted his horse, looked down at her one more time. You'll die here, he said. You understand that? Not maybe, not probably. You'll die. And I won't find your body until the snow melts, and by then the coyotes will have scattered your bones from here to the creek. He rode away without waiting for a response. The math was simple. Hannah sat in the grass that evening and worked through it the way Ingrid had taught her, counting on fingers, scratching numbers in the dirt with a stick. To survive a Dakota winter, the conventional wisdom said a person needed 6 to 8 cords of firewood. A cord was a stack 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 8 feet long. The nearest timber was 40 miles away. Even if she could somehow get there, even if she could somehow cut and split and stack that much wood, even if she could somehow haul it back across 40 miles of open prairie, she was 14 years old and weighed perhaps 90 pounds. Men twice her size spent entire autumns cutting firewood. She had no wagon, no horse, no axe. The rusted scythe in her hands was designed for cutting grass, not timber. But even if she could magically produce 8 cords of firewood, she had no stove to burn it in. The Lindstrom's stove was somewhere between here and the Black Hills, strapped to the back of a wagon driven by a man who had decided his survival mattered more than hers. $3.40. That was what she had. A new stove cost $15 at minimum. 8 cords of cut firewood delivered, she had heard prices at the store in Mitchell, would run $30 or more. She had $3.40. She needed 45. The gap was insurmountable. There was no path from where she stood to where she needed to be. Bjornson was right. The numbers didn't lie. She would die here, unless she found another way. The rain started just after midnight. Hannah had been sleeping in the dugout, despite the mud and the smell of rot. It was the only structure that still had 4 walls and something approximating a roof. But when the rain began, hard, driving, a late summer thunderstorm that turned the sky white with lightning, she felt water rising around her blanket. She grabbed her few possessions and ran. The abandoned haystack loomed against the darkness, 18 feet across and 12 feet high, the remains of the Lindstroms' last hay cutting, the feed they had prepared for cattle that were already dead. Hannah had noticed it before, paid it little attention. It was just grass, dried prairie grass piled in a mound, partially collapsed on one side where weather had eroded it. She ran to it now because it was the only shelter in sight. The haystack had a gap in its south side, a cavity where the collapse had created an overhang. Hannah crawled inside, pulling her blanket after her. The rain drummed on the outer surface of the hay, loud at first, then muffled as she pushed deeper into the gap. And then she noticed something. It was warm. Not warm like a fire, not warm like a stove, but warm compared to the rain-soaked night outside, warm compared to the dugout that held cold like a stone holds water. The hay around her felt almost the same temperature as her own body. She lay still, listening to the storm, feeling the warmth. How? She thought about it. The hay was dry, even though rain was falling. The outer layer absorbed moisture, but the interior stayed protected. The hay was dense, compressed by its own weight. She had to push hard to move through it. And the hay was thick. Where she lay, there was at least 4 feet of dried grass between her body and the outside air. She thought about her wool coat, the one possession from New York she had refused to give up, even when Ingrid said it was too heavy for summer. Wool kept you warm because it trapped air, Ingrid had explained. The tiny spaces between the fibers held still air, and still air didn't conduct heat the way moving air did. Was hay the same? She looked at the grass surrounding her. Millions of stems, millions of tiny spaces, millions of pockets of trapped air. The deeper she pushed into the stack, the warmer it felt. The Lindstrom's hogs had survived the blizzard that killed the cattle. Hannah remembered now Ingrid had mentioned it, almost in passing, as if it were a strange curiosity. The pigs had burrowed into this very haystack when the storm hit. They had emerged 3 days later, hungry but alive, while the cattle froze standing in the open fields. Mice lived in haystacks. Everyone knew that. They built nests deep inside and stayed there all winter. The animals knew something the people didn't. By morning, the idea had taken shape. Hannah couldn't build a cabin. She had no lumber, no tools, no skills. She couldn't cut firewood. She had no trees within 40 miles and no way to transport logs even if she found them. She couldn't buy a stove. She had $3.40, but she had grass. She had more grass than she could ever use, the abandoned haystack, plus unlimited prairie stretching in every direction. She had a rusted scythe that could cut it. She had 2 working hands that could pile it. What if she didn't need a cabin? What if she didn't need a stove? What if the hay itself could keep her warm? She crawled back into the haystack that morning and began measuring with her arms. If she made the stack bigger, much bigger, and hollowed out a space in the center, she could surround herself with 5 or 6 feet of hay in every direction. The trapped air in all that dried grass would hold her body heat inside the same way wool held heat in a coat. She had seen hay bales at the general store in Mitchell, compressed blocks of straw and grass used for feeding livestock. Those bales were perhaps 18 inches thick, and people said they kept barns warmer in winter. What if she had 5 feet instead of 18 inches? What if she had 30 times as much insulation? It was a wild idea, possibly a stupid idea. No one had ever lived inside a haystack through a Dakota winter, but no one had ever had to. She crawled out of the stack and looked at it with new eyes. The shape was wrong, too narrow at the base, too unstable at the top. If she was going to hollow out the center, she needed something stronger, something that would hold its shape when she removed the interior. Her eyes fell on the collapsed fencing at the edge of the property. Barbed wire, rusted but still strong, strung between posts that had rotted and fallen. Eric Lindstrom had strung that fence to keep cattle in. The cattle were dead. The fence was useless, unless she found another use for it. Martha Gruber found her 3 days later. Hannah was in the middle of the prairie, a quarter-mile from the haystack, swinging the rusted scythe in long arcs through the waist-high grass. Her arms ached. Her hands were blistered. She had cut perhaps 200 pounds of grass that day and had at least 200 more to go before dark. Martha Gruber was German, 34 years old, homesteader on the adjacent quarter section to the south. She had 3 children, a husband named Carl, and a 2-room soddy that she kept cleaner than most frame houses. Hannah had seen her before, but never spoken to her. Now Martha stood at the edge of the uncut grass, watching Hannah work. You're the Lindstrom girl, Martha said. Hannah kept swinging. Hannah, what are you doing? Cutting grass. I can see that. Why? Hannah lowered the scythe. Sweat ran down her face despite the September cool. Her hands were bleeding through the cloth she had wrapped around them. I'm building something, she said. Martha's eyes moved to the haystack, visible in the distance. It was already larger than it had been a week ago, perhaps 16 feet across now, and growing. You're adding to the stack, Martha said slowly. Why? Hannah hesitated. She hadn't told anyone about the plan, partly because she wasn't sure it would work, partly because she knew how it would sound. I'm going to live in it, she said finally. Martha said nothing for a long moment. Live in it, she repeated. Inside. I'm going to hollow out a space inside and live there through the winter. Martha Gruber was not a woman who showed surprise easily. She had buried 2 children before they reached their first birthday. She had watched locusts devour an entire season's crops in an afternoon. She had survived 3 Dakota winters in a soddy with walls so thin you could hear coyotes breathing on the other side. But she looked surprised now. You're going to live inside a haystack, she said, through winter, when the temperature drops to 40 below and the wind blows 60 miles an hour and the snow piles higher than your head. Yes. How will you cook? You can't have fire inside hay. 1 spark and you'll burn alive. I won't cook. I'll eat cold food, cornmeal mush, dried meat, whatever I can store that doesn't need heat. The hay will rot. By December you'll be sleeping in mold. Only if it gets wet. I'll keep the interior dry. The outer layers will shed rain and snow. As long as the core stays dry, it won't rot. The first big snow will collapse it flat. Not if I reinforce it. I'm building a frame inside, out of wire, like a cage. It will hold the shape even if snow piles on top. Martha stared at her. You've thought about this. I don't have any other choice. They stood in silence. The wind moved through the grass, making waves that rolled toward the horizon. I have 3 children, Martha said finally. A husband, barely enough food to get us through to spring. I can't take in another mouth, I'm sorry. I'm not asking you to. I know. Martha looked at the haystack again. I think you're going to die in that thing. I think it will rot or collapse, or you'll freeze to death because hay can't hold heat the way wood can. She paused. But I understand why you're trying. She turned and walked back toward her own claim. August Decker came 2 weeks later. Hannah knew him by reputation before she saw his face. Decker was American-born, 26 years old, the son of a successful farmer 3 miles east. He had been waiting for the Lindstrom claim to fail for 2 years. The land had a creek running through it and a stand of cottonwoods at the northeast corner, rare luxuries on the treeless prairie. Once Eric Lindstrom abandoned the claim, Decker would file on it himself. He rode up on a spotted gray mare, sat in the saddle, and laughed. The haystack was 19 feet across now, nearly 14 feet tall. Hannah was on a stepladder she had cobbled together from scrap wood, piling more grass onto the top. Her arms shook with exhaustion. Her dress was stiff with sweat and grass dust. What in God's name is that? Decker said. Hannah climbed down from the ladder. A haystack. That's not a haystack. That's a... He laughed again. I don't know what that is. A rat's nest. That's what it is. A rat's nest big enough to see from Mitchell. It's my home. Your home. Decker shook his head. Lindstrom's girl, right? The orphan train brat? Hannah said nothing. You know this land isn't yours, Decker said. You can't file on it. You're not 21. You're not the head of a family. You're just a squatter, a trespasser. The Lindstroms took me in. This was my home. The Lindstroms are dead and gone. Eric abandoned the claim. That means anybody can file on it. He smiled. Anybody who survives long enough to file anyway. I'm not leaving. Decker leaned forward in his saddle. Listen to me, girl. I've been waiting 2 years for this land. That creek. Those cottonwoods. Do you know what they're worth out here? This is the best quarter section in the township, and you're squatting on it, building a rat's nest out of grass, thinking you're going to survive a Dakota winter without a house, without a stove, without a single cord of firewood. His voice dropped lower. You're going to die here. And when they find your body in the spring, frozen solid, half eaten by coyotes, I'm going to file on this land the same day. So why don't you save us both the trouble? Walk to Mitchell, get on the train, go back wherever you came from. Hannah picked up her scythe, turned back toward the uncut grass. I'm not leaving, she said. Behind her, she heard Decker's horse turn and ride away, but his voice carried back over the sound of hoofbeats. Rat's nest, he called. That's what everyone's going to call it. The girl who lived in a rat's nest and died like a rat. The name spread through the township within a week. Have you seen the rat's nest? Settlers asked each other at the general store in Mitchell. The orphan girl's rat's nest? She's piling up grass like she's building a barn for mice. Some came to look. They rode past on horses or walked over from neighboring claims, stood at a distance, and shook their heads. A few left things, a jar of preserves sitting in the grass 50 yards from the haystack, a wool blanket draped over a fence post. Charity, but at a distance. Nobody wanted to be associated with failure. She'll die in that thing, people said. First hard freeze, and she'll die. Hannah heard them. She kept working. By the end of September, the stack was 20 feet across and 14 feet tall. Inside, she had begun the hollowing, a tunnel from the south side, angling downward so cold air would sink rather than flow into the living space. She worked in 2-hour shifts because the hay dust filled her lungs and made her cough. Every handful of grass she removed from the interior got added to the exterior, making the walls thicker. Her hands had stopped bleeding. The blisters had hardened into calluses as thick as boot leather. She had lost weight, perhaps 10 pounds from a frame that couldn't spare 5, and her dresses hung like sacks. But she was stronger. Her arms, thin as rake handles, could swing the scythe for 6 hours without stopping. The wire frame took shape inside the tunnel. She had salvaged nearly 200 feet of barbed wire from the collapsed fencing, bent it into arched ribs using a rock as a hammer and a fence post as an anvil. The ribs spaced 12 inches apart, woven together with horizontal runs, created a cage roughly 3 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 3 feet high. Just big enough to lie down, just strong enough, she hoped, to keep the ceiling from collapsing. October brought the first hard frost. She woke on the 4th of the month to find ice in the water bucket and her breath crystallizing in the air. The inside of the hay burrow, she had stopped thinking of it as a haystack, held the night's warmth better than she expected. While frost whitened the grass outside, the interior felt almost comfortable. But almost comfortable wasn't the same as warm, and the temperature in October barely touched 20 degrees. In January, it would drop to 40 below. She kept working. The windstorm hit on October 8th. Hannah had seen prairie storms before, the rolling black clouds, the lightning that struck the open ground, the winds that flattened standing grass like a giant hand pressing down. But she had never been outside during one. She was inside the hay burrow when it started. The tunnel was mostly complete now, the wire cage installed, the interior chamber hollowed to its full dimensions. She heard the wind rise from a whisper to a howl, felt the entire structure shudder around her. Then she heard something tear. She crawled to the tunnel entrance and looked out. The south side of the stack, the side that faced the prevailing wind, was peeling away. Sheets of hay ripped free and tumbled across the prairie like enormous tumbleweeds. The work of days, scattered in minutes. By the time the storm passed, 2 full days of construction had been destroyed. The tunnel entrance was exposed, the careful layering of the exterior wall torn open. She would have to rebuild it all. She stood in the wreckage as the last light faded, feeling something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in weeks. Despair. It was October 8th. The first hard freeze could come any day now. Snow was coming, real cold was coming, and she had just lost 48 hours of work she couldn't afford to lose. Bjornson was right, Decker was right, Martha Gruber was right. She was going to die here. Martha Gruber arrived on October 19th. Hannah didn't hear her approach. She was inside the burrow, reinforcing the repaired south wall, when a voice called from outside. "Girl! Hannah, come out!" She crawled through the tunnel and found Martha standing 10 feet from the entrance, holding a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Martha's oldest daughter, a girl of perhaps 12, stood behind her, carrying a second bundle. "I'm not helping you survive in that rat's nest," Martha said. Her voice was flat, matter of fact, the way Bjornson's had been when he predicted Hannah's death. "But I had extra, and it would just go to waste." She set the bundle on the ground and unwrapped it. 2 wool blankets, a small jar of rendered tallow, the fat from a butchered hog, useful for waterproofing and treating cracked skin, 15 pounds of dried corn, and beneath it all, folded carefully, a buffalo robe. The hide was worn, the fur matted in places, but it was intact. A buffalo robe could mean the difference between sleeping and freezing. "Where did you get this?" Hannah asked. "It was my mother's. She brought it from the old country. It doesn't fit in our sadi anymore, and it's too heavy for the children to use." Hannah looked at the pile. It was worth $4, maybe 5, more than she had in the world. "I can't pay you," she said. "I'm not asking for money." Martha straightened. "Come spring, you'll help with our planting. 3 days of work, that's the trade." It was a fiction, and both of them knew it. If Hannah survived until spring, she would have proven something that made 3 days of labor irrelevant. If she didn't survive, the trade was meaningless anyway, but the fiction let them both preserve their pride. 3 days, Hannah said. "When the ground thaws." Martha nodded. She turned to leave, then stopped. "The entrance," she said, looking at the tunnel opening. "You should face it east, not south. The worst storms come from the northwest. South faces the prevailing wind." "I know, but south gets the most sun. The entrance warms faster after a storm." Martha studied her for a moment. "You've thought about this." "I don't have any other choice." Martha and her daughter walked away across the prairie. Hannah watched them go, then gathered the supplies and crawled back into her burrow. By the end of October, the shelter was complete. 20 feet across, 14 feet tall, walls 5 feet thick in every direction, compressed from thousands of pounds of native prairie grass. An entrance tunnel 2 feet wide and 3 feet long, angled downward 30 degrees so cold air would sink and warm air would stay trapped in the chamber. A wire cage reinforcing the interior, arched ribs and horizontal struts holding the ceiling in place. A door made from bundled hay that could be pulled into the tunnel to seal the entrance. Hannah crawled inside and lay in the darkness. The interior chamber measured 3 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 3 feet high, coffin-sized. She could lie flat but not sit up. She could roll over but not stretch her arms. The walls pressed close on every side, the compressed grass releasing a smell like summer fields dried in the sun. She had 90 days of food at starvation rations, 40 pounds of cornmeal, 12 pounds of salt pork, the dried corn from Martha Gruber, a small amount of beans. She would eat cold, no fire, not ever, not inside a structure made entirely of dried grass. She would drink snow melt, gathering snow in a bucket and letting her body heat warm it enough to drink. She had the buffalo robe, 2 wool blankets, the clothes on her back. She had no fuel, no stove, no heat source except her own body. But she had walls, 5 feet of trapped air in every direction, millions of tiny pockets in the dried grass, holding still air that didn't conduct heat the way open air did. Her body produced warmth. She had learned this, felt it, understood it now. A resting body generated heat like a small fire. If the walls held that heat inside instead of letting it escape, it would work or it wouldn't. She would live or she wouldn't. There was nothing left to do but wait. November came in cold. The first night she spent entirely inside the burrow, the temperature outside dropped to 18 degrees. She crawled through the entrance tunnel, pulled the hay bundle door closed behind her, and wrapped herself in the buffalo robe. The darkness was absolute. No candle, no lamp, nothing that could produce flame. She lay in the blackness and listened to her own breathing. Within an hour, the space began to warm. Not warm like summer, not warm like a house with a stove, but warmer than the outside air, warmer than the dugout she had slept in through September. Her breath still crystallized in the air, but the shivering that had racked her body when she first entered slowly faded. She slept. When she woke, the chill had settled, but she was not cold, not truly cold. Her fingers moved freely. Her feet had feeling. The interior of the hay burrow felt like a root cellar, cool but not freezing, uncomfortable but not deadly. She crawled outside into a world rimed with frost. Her breath came in white plumes. The grass crunched under her feet, but she had survived the night. November deepened. The temperature dropped to single digits, then below zero. Hannah learned the rhythms of the burrow. Enter before sunset, seal the entrance, curl into the buffalo robe, wait for body heat to fill the small space. By morning, the interior would stabilize somewhere above freezing, perhaps 35 degrees, perhaps 40. Cold enough to see her breath, warm enough to keep her alive. She ate once a day, cornmeal mixed with snow, eaten half frozen because there was no fire to cook it. Salt pork, gnawed straight from the slab. Dried corn, crunched between teeth that ached from the cold. Her body burned through the calories faster than she took them in. She could feel herself shrinking, her ribs emerging, her hip bones pressing against the buffalo robe. But she was alive. On November 25th, she crawled outside to find Niels Bjornson sitting on his horse, staring at the haystack. He didn't speak. She didn't either. They looked at each other for a long moment, the old Norwegian who had buried a wife and son to the cold, and the 14-year-old girl who had built a house out of grass. "You're alive," he said finally. "I'm alive." How warm. Above freezing, maybe 40 degrees inside. He sat very still on his horse. She could see him working through the implications, the physics of trapped air, the insulation of compressed grass, the way body heat could fill a small space when there was nowhere for it to escape. "It won't last," he said. "Wait until real winter. Wait until January. I'll wait." He turned his horse and rode away, and Hannah crawled back into her burrow to wait for the real winter to arrive. December passed in darkness and cold. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero for 3 days in the middle of the month. Hannah stayed inside the burrow for all 3, emerging only to gather snow and empty the covered bucket she used for waste. The hay walls held. The interior stayed above freezing. Her body heat, trapped by 5 feet of grass, kept the small chamber survivable. She lost track of days. She lost track of weeks. Time became a rhythm of darkness and cold, sleeping and waking, eating the same cold mush from the same tin bowl. Her world shrank to the dimensions of a coffin, 3 feet by 6 feet by 3 feet. The only sounds were her own breathing and the wind that howled across the prairie but could not reach her. In the darkness, she talked to herself. She recited poems she remembered from the orphanage school. She counted backward from 1,000. She named every person she had ever known, from the youngest orphan on the train to Ingrid Lindstrom, dying in a soddy that no longer existed. On Christmas Day, she ate an extra portion of salt pork and pretended it was a feast. January arrived like a held breath finally released. The new year began mild, temperatures in the teens, light snow, winds that barely stirred the drifts that had piled around the haystack. Hannah emerged more often, stretching legs that had begun to cramp from endless immobility. She walked to the frozen creek and chipped through the ice to fill her bucket. She stood in the pale winter sunlight and felt warmth on her face for the first time in weeks. On January 11th, the temperature climbed into the 30s. Snow melted into mud. The sky turned clear and blue, the kind of day that felt almost spring-like. She walked to the creek that morning, bucket in hand, and washed her face in the snowmelt. The sun felt warm. The wind was mild. She had survived November, December, and most of January. The rat's nest had worked. She tilted her face toward the sky and allowed herself something she hadn't felt in 5 months. Hope. She did not know that 1,200 miles to the northwest, in the Canadian territories, a mass of Arctic air was gathering, cold beyond anything the northern plains had seen in living memory. A wall of frozen atmosphere that would move south at 50 miles per hour, dropping temperatures 60 degrees in 6 hours. She did not know that this was the last warm day she would see for weeks. She did not know that in less than 24 hours, cattle would freeze standing in fields, children would die between schoolhouses and homes, and the worst blizzard in Dakota history would test every shelter, every preparation, every assumption about what it took to survive. The real test was coming, and when it arrived, she would not be inside her burrow. January the 12th, 1888, began like a gift. Hannah woke before dawn inside the hay burrow, the air cool but not painful, her breath visible in the darkness. She had survived another night. She had survived 123 nights since the first hard frost. When she crawled outside, the world had transformed. The brutal cold of the previous weeks had lifted. The temperature stood somewhere in the mid-30s, warm enough that snow dripped from the haystack's exterior, warm enough that she could stand outside without her coat and feel almost comfortable. Across the prairie, settlers emerged from their soddies and dugouts to enjoy the unexpected warmth. Farmers walked their fields in shirt sleeves. Children left for school without heavy wraps. Cattle that had huddled in barns for weeks were turned out to graze on the melting snow. Hannah stood in the pale morning sunlight and made a decision that would nearly kill her. She needed water. The bucket she used for drinking and washing had run dry 2 days earlier, and she had been melting snow inside the burrow, a slow, tedious process that never produced enough. The creek was 300 yards away, frozen solid on top but still running beneath the ice. If she chipped through, she could fill the bucket properly for the first time in weeks. 300 yards, perhaps 5 minutes of walking. The sky was clear. The air was mild. What could go wrong? She picked up the bucket and walked toward the creek. The morning passed in quiet industry. At the Bjornson farm, a mile to the northwest, Niels Bjornson turned his surviving cattle out of the barn. 12 head remained from the 30 he had owned before the blizzard of 1886. The animals moved slowly into the melting snow, their breath steaming in the cool air. Bjornson watched them graze and allowed himself to think that perhaps the worst of winter was behind them. At the Decker farm, 3 miles to the east, August Decker's younger brother Franz saddled a horse to ride into Mitchell. He was 19 years old, newly engaged to a girl from the next township, planning to buy supplies for the wedding that would happen in spring. He wore a light coat. The day was warm. In schoolhouses across Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Minnesota, children sat at their desks reciting lessons. Many had walked miles to school that morning, their parents trusting the mild weather to hold. Teachers propped open doors to let in the unseasonable warmth. No one was watching the northwestern horizon. The cold front appeared at noon. One moment the sky was clear. The next, a wall of gray-white cloud materialized on the horizon, moving south with a speed that defied comprehension. Observers would later calculate that the front traveled at nearly 50 miles per hour, faster than a horse at full gallop, faster than a locomotive on open track. Within minutes, the temperature began to fall. At the creek, 300 yards from her haystack, Hannah had just finished filling her bucket. She knelt on the ice, water sloshing against the bucket's sides, when she felt the wind change. The mild breeze that had blown from the south all morning suddenly died. For a heartbeat, the air went completely still. Then the cold hit. It came from the northwest like a living thing, a wall of frozen air that slammed into her back and nearly knocked her flat. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in seconds, 20 degrees in a minute. The water in her bucket began to skin over with ice. Hannah looked toward the haystack. 300 yards away, she could barely see it through the sudden haze that filled the air. She dropped the bucket and ran. The blizzard announced itself with a sound like tearing canvas, the shriek of wind accelerating from stillness to 60 miles per hour in less than a minute. Snow began falling, but not the fat, lazy flakes of a normal storm. This snow was fine as flour, driven horizontal by the wind, filling the air so completely that visibility dropped to arm's length in seconds. Hannah ran blind. She knew the direction. The haystack was south and slightly east of the creek, 300 yards in a straight line. She had walked this path a dozen times. She could do it with her eyes closed. But the wind was pushing her. Each gust hit like a physical blow, staggering her sideways, driving her off course. The cold penetrated her light wool dress as if the fabric weren't there. Her face, exposed to the wind, began to burn. She counted her steps. 100 steps should cover roughly 300 feet. 300 steps should bring her to the haystack. At 100 steps, she saw nothing. At 200 steps, she saw nothing. At 300 steps, her outstretched hands found only empty air. She had missed it. The cold was inside her now. Hannah dropped to her hands and knees. The snow was less dense near the ground. She could see perhaps 3 feet instead of 3 inches. But 3 feet of visibility meant nothing when she didn't know which direction to crawl. She had veered off course. The wind had pushed her east, away from the haystack, out into the open prairie, where there was nothing but grass and snow and cold that would kill her in minutes. Her fingers had stopped hurting. That was bad. Pain meant the nerves were still working. Numbness meant the tissue was freezing. She couldn't feel her face, couldn't feel her ears. The wind cut through her dress like knives made of ice. Think, think. South. The haystack was south of the creek. The wind was blowing from the northwest, which meant if she turned her back to the wind, she would be facing southeast. Close enough. She began crawling. 10 yards. 20. Her hands pushed through snow that was already ankle deep, accumulating faster than she had ever seen snow fall. 30 yards. 40. Her right hand touched something that wasn't grass. Wire. The barbed wire she had strung around the exterior of the haystack, salvaged from the Lindstrom's collapsed fence, woven around the outside of the stack to hold its shape against the wind. The wire that had seemed like a minor detail, an afterthought, a solution to a problem she hadn't even known was important. The wire that was now the only thing standing between her and death. She grabbed it. The barbs bit into her frozen hands, but she couldn't feel them. She followed the wire hand over hand, crawling through the snow, letting the fence lead her home. The entrance tunnel appeared out of the white chaos like a dark mouth in the snow. Hannah dove through it head first, dragging her legs behind her, pulling herself into the darkness with arms that barely functioned. Her hands were bleeding. She could see the red stains on the hay, but she felt nothing. Her face was swollen, her ears burning with the first agonizing return of sensation. She pulled the hay bundle door into the tunnel behind her, sealing out the wind. The shriek of the blizzard dropped to a muffled roar. Snow that had been driving horizontally now simply fell from her clothes in clumps. She was inside. But inside wasn't enough. Inside was just a space. Inside was just darkness and hay, and the clothes on her back, clothes that were soaked with melted snow, clothes that would freeze solid if she didn't get warm. She stripped off the wet dress with hands that wouldn't obey her commands. It took minutes to undo buttons that normally took seconds. The dress fell away, and she wrapped herself in the buffalo robe, pulling it tight, curling into a ball with her knees against her chest. Then she waited. The physics of survival played out in the darkness. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. By 2 o'clock, it had dropped to 20 degrees. By 4 o'clock, it stood at 5 above zero. By 8 o'clock, the thermometer at the weather station in Huron, Dakota Territory, read 22 degrees below zero. By midnight, it would reach -40. The wind maintained a constant 60 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 70. The wind chill, a concept that wouldn't be formally calculated for another 50 years, pushed the effective temperature to 70 below zero. Exposed flesh froze in less than a minute. Inside the hay burrow, Hannah shivered. Shivering was good. Shivering meant her body was generating heat, burning calories to produce warmth. A shivering body could output 250 watts, more than double the normal resting rate. The heat had nowhere to go. 5 feet of compressed prairie hay surrounded her in every direction. Millions of dried grass stems filled with millions of tiny air pockets, each pocket a barrier to heat transfer. The R value of those walls, a measurement of thermal resistance, exceeded 75. A modern insulated house might achieve R30 in its walls. Hannah's hay burrow insulated more than twice as well. Her body heat filled the small chamber. The shivering continued for the first hour, then slowly subsided. The interior temperature climbed from freezing toward something survivable. By midnight, with the outside air at 40 below zero and the wind screaming at 60 miles per hour, the inside of the hay burrow had stabilized somewhere above 35 degrees. Uncomfortable, cold enough that she could see her breath, cold enough that she kept the buffalo robe wrapped tight, but not deadly. The hay held. Across the prairie, the dying began. At the Bjornson farm, Niels Bjornson made it from his house to his barn by following a rope he had strung between the buildings 7 years earlier, a precaution born from nearly dying in the blizzard of 1881. The cattle he had turned out that morning were not so fortunate. 18 of his 12 remaining head froze in the fields. He would find them the next day, standing upright in the snow, eyes open and frosted white, legs frozen so solid they shattered when he tried to move the bodies. At the Decker farm, August Decker's brother Franz never made it to Mitchell. His horse threw him a mile from home when the storm hit. He tried to walk back. His body was found 2 days later, 100 yards from the farmhouse, frozen in a running posture, his face turned toward the home he never reached. In a one-room schoolhouse near O'Neill, Nebraska, a teacher named Etta Shattuck dismissed her students early, trying to beat the storm. She lost her way walking home and wandered for hours before finding a haystack. She burrowed into it the same way Hannah had burrowed into hers, the same instinct, the same desperate logic. She survived 78 hours in that haystack, but the frostbite took both her legs. She died from surgical complications 3 weeks later. She was 19 years old. In schoolhouses across Dakota Territory, teachers made impossible decisions. Some kept their students inside, burning furniture to keep the fires going, waiting out the storm. Some led their students toward home, roping children together in human chains so they wouldn't lose each other in the whiteout. Minnie Freeman, a teacher in Ord, Nebraska, tied her students together with twine and led them nearly a mile to safety. She became a national hero. Others tried the same thing and led their students to their deaths. By the time the blizzard ended, between 235 and 500 people were dead. The exact number would never be known. Bodies continued to emerge from snowdrifts through April. They called it the school children's blizzard, the children's blizzard, the Great White Death. And in a haystack in Davison County, a 14-year-old orphan lay wrapped in a buffalo robe, listening to the wind scream, waiting for morning. The storm blew itself out by noon the next day. Hannah emerged from the hay burrow into a world made alien by snow. Drifts 8 feet high curled around the haystack like frozen waves. The prairie, flat as a table the day before, now rolled with white hills that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. The silence was absolute. No wind, no bird song. Nothing moved anywhere she could see. She stood on shaking legs. She had barely moved in 18 hours, and looked at her hands. The palms were torn where the barbed wire had cut them. 2 fingertips on her left hand were waxy and white, the telltale pallor of frostbite. Her face felt swollen, her ears ached, and when she touched her nose, the pain made her gasp. But she was standing. In the distance, toward the Bjornson farm, she could see dark shapes in the snow. It took her a moment to understand what they were. Cattle, standing upright, not moving, frozen where they stood. Niels Bjornson walked to the Lindstrom claim on January 14th. Hannah saw him coming from a distance, a dark figure moving slowly across the white prairie, his gait unsteady, his shoulders hunched. He had aged 10 years in 2 days. His face, when he got close enough for her to see it, was gray with exhaustion. He stopped 10 feet from the haystack and stood there, looking at it, looking at the entrance tunnel, looking at Hannah, who sat on a drift pile melting snow over a small fire of dried grass. "You're alive," he said. His voice sounded hollow, scraped out. "I'm alive." Bjornson walked closer. He studied the structure, the compressed walls, the wire reinforcement, the entrance tunnel angled downward to trap warm air. He had dismissed it as a rat's nest 5 months ago. He had told her she would die in a pile of grass. "How warm?" he asked. "Above freezing, maybe 35, 40 degrees. "All night?" "All night. The walls hold the heat. My body keeps it warm. It's—" She stopped. She didn't have the words to explain the physics, the R values, the trapped air pockets. "It works." Bjornson was quiet for a long moment. Then he held up his right hand, the one missing 2 fingers. "I lost these in the blizzard of '81, he said. "I was inside my house. I had a stove burning full. I nearly died walking 30 feet to my barn." He lowered the hand. 18 of my cattle froze yesterday, standing in the field, eyes open. I'll be burning carcasses for a week." He looked at the haystack again. I told you that you'd freeze in that pile of grass, that nobody would find your body until spring. I remember. I was wrong. The words hung in the cold air. Hannah didn't know what to say. She had spent 5 months being told she would die. She had half believed it herself. Now she was alive, and the man who had predicted her death was standing in front of her, admitting his mistake. Franz Decker is dead, Bjornson said. August's brother. They found him this morning, 100 yards from his house. He couldn't find his way in the whiteout. Hannah thought of August Decker calling her shelter a rat's nest, telling her she would die and he would file on her land the same day they found her body. His brother hadn't made it 100 yards. I'm sorry, she said. Bjornson nodded slowly. Build me one. What? For the cattle. A shelter like yours, but bigger, big enough for a dozen head. If I'd had something like this, something they could have gotten inside. He stopped, swallowed. Build me one. I'll pay you, whatever you want. Hannah looked at the old Norwegian, the man who had survived 9 Dakota winters, who had buried a wife and son to the cold, who had lost 2 fingers and 18 cattle, and was now asking an orphan girl to teach him how to survive. I don't want payment, she said. I'll show you how it works. I'll show anyone who wants to learn. Word spread the way word always spreads in small communities, through gossip, through visits, through the simple fact that Hannah Killand was alive when everyone had expected her to be dead. Martha Gruber came first, 2 days after the storm. She brought her husband Carl and her 3 children, and they stood in front of the haystack the way pilgrims might stand before a shrine. Martha walked around it twice, studying the construction, the wire reinforcement, the entrance tunnel. I said it would rot, she said. I said it would collapse. I know. I was wrong. She crouched beside the entrance and peered into the darkness. How deep are the walls? 5 feet, maybe 6 in some places. And it stayed above freezing in a storm that dropped to 40 below. 35, maybe 40 degrees inside, warm enough. Martha stood. She looked at her husband. Something passed between them, the silent communication of people who had been married a long time. Teach us, she said. We want to build one for the livestock, for the chickens, maybe a smaller one we could use in an emergency. I'll teach you. Within 2 weeks, 4 neighboring homesteads had sent people to study the hay burrow. They measured the walls, they examined the wire frame. They asked questions about ventilation, about moisture, about how deep the entrance should go. Hannah answered everything she could and admitted when she didn't know. I didn't plan most of this, she told them. I didn't have any other choice. I had hay and wire, and that was it. So I built what I could build. The Chelin Burrow, they started calling it, the hay house, the rat's nest that saved a life. By spring, a dozen homesteads in Davison County had incorporated some version of hay bale insulation into their buildings. Hay-packed walls for chicken coops, straw bale windbreaks for cattle, emergency shelters pre-built and waiting for the next storm. The method spread the way good ideas always spread on the frontier, hand to hand, neighbor to neighbor, each person adapting the technique to their own needs. August Decker never came to see the hay burrow. He buried his brother in the frozen ground 3 days after the storm, chipping through ice-hard soil with a pickaxe while his father stood by and wept. Franz had been the younger son, the cheerful one, the one everyone expected to carry on the family name. He had died 100 yards from home, 100 yards from warmth, 100 yards from survival. August stopped talking about filing on the Lindstrom claim. He stopped calling Hannah's shelter a rat's nest. He stopped making predictions about who would die and when. Years later, long after Hannah had proved up her own homestead and married and raised children of her own, August Decker would tell someone that he had been wrong about the orphan girl, that she had understood something about survival that he hadn't, that his brother might have lived if they had built something similar on their own land, but he never said it to Hannah directly. Some lessons cost too much to speak aloud. Within 2 years, at least a dozen homesteads in Davison County had incorporated some version of hay bale insulation into their buildings. The principle Hannah had discovered by accident trapped air in compressed grass, creating a thermal barrier, spread through the community like ripples in a pond. Chicken coops with hay-packed walls, cattle shelters with straw bale windbreaks, root cellars lined with prairie grass. Hannah taught the technique to anyone who asked. She charged nothing, claimed no credit, sought no recognition. What she had built, she built because she had no other choice. That it worked seemed less important than that others could use it too. She was 15 years old. Hannah Kelland remained on the Lindstrom claim. The land was not legally hers. She was too young to file, too alone to qualify as head of household, but no one challenged her right to stay. August Decker never filed his claim. The neighbors who had called her shelter a rat's nest now came to her for advice. At 21, she filed on the adjacent quarter section and proved it up over the required 5 years. She married a Norwegian immigrant named Anders Holstad in 1894. They raised 3 children on the combined claim, 480 acres of Dakota prairie that had once belonged to people who gave up. She lived the rest of her life in Davison County. She saw the prairie change from open grassland to fenced farms to mechanized agriculture. She watched automobiles replace horses and electricity replace kerosene. She outlived 2 of her 3 children. She died in 1952, age 79, in the same county where she had built her hay burrow 64 years earlier. Her obituary in the Mitchell newspaper mentioned her children, her grandchildren, her church. It did not mention the haystack. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 60 degrees in 7 hours. Cattle froze standing in fields across Dakota Territory. Children died between schoolhouses and homes. Teachers led students into the white chaos and lost them in the drifts. The Bjornson herd, 30 head reduced to 12, took 3 days to burn after the storm passed. Niels Bjornson had ridden to the Lindstrom claim 5 months before that storm and told a 14-year-old girl what he knew to be true. A girl alone can't survive a Dakota winter. You'll freeze in that pile of grass, and nobody will find your body until spring thaw. Hannah Kelland did not freeze. She lay in her chamber of compressed prairie hay while the wind screamed at 60 miles per hour and the thermometer dropped to 40 below. 5 feet of grass in every direction. Millions of trapped air pockets holding heat that had nowhere to go. Her body warmth filling the small space the way water fills a cup. The last thing she heard before sleeping, that first night after the storm, was silence. The wind had stopped. The blizzard had passed. She was alive. And outside her burrow, under 8 feet of snow, the prairie waited for spring.